Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the SAEON seminar series. For your information, the session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the SAEON YouTube page. And we will have some time for questions at the end of the presentation. As introduction, I'm Ryan Blanchard from the Fynbos node, and I'm happy to introduce Dr. Jonathan Muller to talk about his work as a postdoc while at Stellenbosch University under the supervision of Professor Guy Midgley. So his project started in 2023, and with the help of FTON and Fynbos node staff, Jonathan was able to access high-quality data from the Yonkers Flux Tower in Stellenbosch. And his input has helped us improve our understanding of the flux data and also how we meant to capture data, as well as our data management principles. So we look forward to his research, as he has made some interesting findings with the data, and his presentation is titled Fire as a Catalyst for Carbon Sequestration, Respiration, Suppression, and Regeneration Feedback in South African Fynbos Shrubland. So over to you, Jonathan, and thank you for giving this talk today.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen here. It should work in a second. And then... Okay, so I hope everyone can see my screen. Right. So thanks, Ryan, for the introduction. As mentioned, I was at Stellenbosch University while I did this project with Guy Midgley and a bunch of others. And you can see here I've included Warren Joubert and Abri de Buis from the EFTON node in Cape Town. They were tremendous help with collecting all the data and analyzing this. Right. So I have to say, at the start of my project, I did not expect to go into fire, but since the site burned down in 2021, this became a very interesting focus. Now, why are we interested in fire? We know that global wildfires emit about a third of the magnitude of the annual land carbon sink, meaning without wildfires, the land carbon sink would be significantly higher. And Africa is actually the continent that has the largest proportion of its surface burning annually. You can see on the right a photo of the last fire, the one that I will be talking about here above Stellenbosch, and also the aftermath of that fire. Now, fires have significant effects, obviously, on the ecosystem. They reduce the gross primary productivity and the ecosystem respiration. So GPP, the gross primary productivity, and RECO, the ecosystem respiration. For example, in some pine stands, we've seen a reduction of about 50%. In other places in the world, we also see a significant reduction in net radiation, mainly driven by the reduction in albedo, which was discussed in some studies in Australia, as you can see, and also a reduction in evapotranspiration. This is related to there being less plant biomass that transpires the water that they capture with their root. Now, when we think of the effect of these fires, one of the main discussions globally is how long does it take for an ecosystem to return to a sink function. In temperate and boreal ecosystems, this can be between 10 and 50 years until we again have a carbon sink. Mediterranean ecosystems tend to be a bit faster, between 1 and 7 years is what I've seen in literature studies. And in tropical ecosystems, this is the fastest. It can be as low as 1 year, obviously related as well to the amount of rainfall and the temperatures that allow for prolific growth. Now, we don't have many observations in Africa in general. As you know, Africa is the continent with the fewest biosphere to atmosphere flux measurements. And in particular, with regards to fire, there are some studies, but those exact dynamics of carbon sequestration are still a big gap. Now, the field site is one of SAEON EFTion's sites. It's the Fynbos node near Stellenbosch. It is, as you all probably know, part of this unique Cape Floristic region. It is a Mediterranean type shrubland. So we have hot, dry summers, unlike what you might know in Pretoria and Johannesburg, where it's a lot more humid during summer. And of course, a vast amount of endemism. Now, these plants are all adapted to fire. Many of them will germinate only when treated with smoke or when they are exposed to heat. And some of them have also developed the ability to resprout after fire. In general, at this site, we have a fire return interval of about 10 to 15 years. At least that's what was published there in 2010. The last fire was in 2021. I've been asked the question of whether that is still true, because the fire that occurred right before that was in 2015. So that was only 6 years. And one thing that we know is that climate change will lead to an increase in fire return intervals and, decrease in return intervals, so increase in frequency. Obviously, this is not the case everywhere and not necessarily measured here, but I will use some of those numbers for the shorter intervals and the longer intervals, and I will get back to that in a moment. Now, sampling started by SAEON at this site in 2019 with eddy covariance. And in 2023, we came and measured resprouting and reseeding protea species, the main woody species in this ecosystem, in the Jonkershoek catchment, and measured monthly with a porometer fluorometer and bi-monthly with a Lycor 6800 for reference. This is to get the light response and generally the photosynthetic response of these plants at a leaf scale. Because we wanted to quantify the ecosystem scale carbon feedbacks and how the energy flux shifts following wildfire. I have to say here, I am really thankful to SAEON staff for all the data that they provided, in particular because I asked them for the raw data so I could reprocess everything. As you can see in the photo, this site is not entirely flat. So I wanted to be sure that the flux measurements that I get are processed in detail. So I reprocessed it using, and this is for the technical stuff, maybe it's more of interest, using a planar fit, and that helped improve the data quality. But so the rejection of flux half hours went from about 40% down to 15%, just for reference. Right. Beside looking at those fluxes, we also wanted to identify the biological drivers of this carbon sequestration. Now, I'll come to my results. You can see in the figure on my right, we have a cumulative annual carbon gain in tons of carbon per hectare. And you will see a pre-fire in black and post-fire in blue. This is by month, so it basically accumulates across the year. And these are basically the combined years before and after the fire. So we did an average of each day essentially across those years to get an assessment and also to use multiple years to fill potential gaps that we might have had in the data. Now, the interesting thing here is, so this is 3 years before, 3 years after. The interesting thing here is that the wildfire seems to have increased the net carbon sink by about 20%. So we went from 8.2 tons of carbon per hectare to 10.4. And that is something basically unheard of. Normally, like I said, we would have expected a reduction in sink function simply because the biomass is gone. Then when we looked at the energy exchange, so you have at the bottom right the 4 different seasons with the 3 main energy components. So net radiation, Rn, sensible heat, and latent heat. And you have diurnal curves for each of them. So basically during the day, net radiation goes up, goes down during the night, and as expected below 0 during the night because we have an emission of long-wave radiation. The same or similar trends are true for sensible heat and for latent heat. We always have some, but nothing unexpected there. The strange thing here, or surprising thing rather, is that the difference between the pre and the post-fire ecosystem is not at all significant. So you can see that the errors, the gray shaded areas, completely overlap. Essentially, this means that in spite of the change in albedo, the surface being completely blackened by this fire, the ecosystem recovered so quickly that we do not actually see any significant change in how solar energy gets absorbed, but also not in how much sensible or latent heat is emitted from the ecosystem. Okay. Now, where it gets really interesting in terms of understanding this increased carbon sink is that we saw basically a slight reduction in GPP in summer, but more than a 50% suppression of ecosystem respiration. You can see that with my red arrows there. Again, these are diurnal curves. These are the 4 seasons. And this reduction, this drop in ecosystem respiration can have 2 causes, basically the loss in plant biomass or the reduction in soil activity. The heat of a fire might have, for example, killed all the bacteria or something in the soil. We don't have a full answer as to what this might be, but we are actually wondering how this is possible, and this is actually a big question for future research. Now, this means that obviously because the GPP and ecosystem respiration combined end up being the net ecosystem sink, that is the reason for this increase in the carbon sink function. Okay. Now, this increase is only possible if plants regrow very rapidly. So actually within about 5 or 6 months, I believe, from what I remember in my data set, we could already see a significant sink that almost exceeded the before fire sink function. So clearly, these plants that are adapted to fire are so well adapted that they regrow in a very fast fashion. Okay. So the other thing that we can see is a consistent carbon uptake in the Fynbos. Even though there is a slowdown in winter, which you can see here with my red arrow, that slowdown is not actually significant enough so to actually switch into an emission. For example, in Europe, you will often see that ecosystems switch to emission of carbon particularly when the leaves die in autumn. And in Fynbos, this is not at all the case. The plants grow throughout the year. And those sequestration rates are rather significant. Now, in the literature, in the past, some sequestration rates that were measured through biometric methods, so looking at plant biomass, estimated 1 to 4 tons of carbon per hectare per year. But when we look in our measurements, we see more than 8 tons per hectare per year. And those method differences cannot be explained simply by the method differences. So it's not that someone measured wrong here in a sense. It is actually a mystery of where this carbon goes. As you can see, if we were below 1 ton of carbon per hectare, then that might be a method difference issue, but this is not the explanation here. So over 10 to 15 years, this means that we have a cumulative carbon uptake of somewhere between 83 to 130 tons of carbon per hectare. We know from the literature that the above ground biomass in such a time period would be around 25 to 26 tons of carbon per hectare. And that means that we now have a missing sink in Fynbos of 57 to 95 tons of carbon per hectare. That is a significant missing sink. So the question that leads to is what is actually driving this consistent carbon sequestration and where does this carbon go? I can answer the first question. The second one is one that I'm still hoping to analyze in the future, but is a question that will for now have to remain open. Now, what is driving this carbon sequestration is something that I've partially given away before, but you see here what the results were from our measurements on the leaf scale. So we went and measured the leaves of seedlings and adults of both resprouters and reseeders. So the resprouter seedlings in yellow, the resprouter adults in gray, the reseeder, those were only seedlings because obviously the adults had been burned off, are in blue. And in my figure on the right, you see the partial response of a GAM, generalized additive model. And that shows two interesting things. First off, the resprouters have a much lower response. So here actually we're looking at the response of stomatal conductance, which in the analysis turned out to be the strongest determining factor here for the carbon uptake that we saw. And they have a much lower response, whether it is with their contribution of sunlight, so PAR, or VPD, vapor pressure deficit, or soil water contribution, and also the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Now, what's important to say here is that the soil water contribution and the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere both had basically no effect at all on how those resprouters control their stomata. Where we did see some effect is with VPD and PAR, but it is low compared to the reseeders. So the reseeding plants responded very quickly to environmental conditions and interestingly also responded relatively strongly to CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. This is somewhat expected given that reseeders are known to be opportunistic. They basically live in a high risk sort of strategy. They have to regrow quickly and mature and generate seeds as quickly as possible before the next fire comes. The resprouters have time. They will just burn partially and then resprout and continue growing. So they can use a much more conservative strategy. Right. Now, this CO2 sensitivity was measured within the annual range of CO2. So we had 390 ppm to 420 ppm from winter to summer, which is quite a large range. But what this shows and is most interesting is actually that these plants, they are most active in winter, and yet that is also when they are most restricted in terms of carbon. So they will respond very quickly to having a lot of soil, water, etc., which again is winter. But if the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere rise, then these are the plants that will probably benefit the most because they will be able to now do a lot more photosynthesis very rapidly. Let me actually say a few more words here. So when we think of the future in terms of climate change, we will be seeing a higher fire return frequency. And what this leads to with these results is that basically reseeders will be able to grow faster because of the higher CO2 concentration and potentially reach maturity faster. So intuitively, they should be the ones benefiting. But at the same time, because they are sensitive to propagating, generating seeds fast enough before the next fire, they might also be under a lot of pressure, and that might benefit the resprouters. So the story doesn't end here. We don't really know what climate change will do to this ecosystem in detail. Now, in conclusion, Fynbos is a hidden sink. It is a significant carbon sink that we really need to protect. The change in albedo and NDVI as a result was not significant. And this is important because a lot of studies that assess the activity of ecosystems use satellite imagery, mostly albedo and NDVI. And clearly in an ecosystem like Fynbos, these values are not really meaningful. This might actually be true in other African ecosystems as well. We just currently don't know. But what this means is that the estimates, and particularly the pressure from global north actors of, for example, planting trees to sequester more carbon for carbon credits, that pressure might be actually leading to problems. Because if we think, for example, that this ecosystem could be invaded by pines, we already know that pines are invasive in this area, and there is active forestry happening next to the protected area where pines are the main cash crop. So if this ecosystem was invaded by pines, then this would shift the carbon sequestration from below ground, which we currently are fairly certain is happening there, to above ground. Now, above ground biomass means that it is sensitive to burning. And if it burns, it obviously returns to the atmosphere. With Fynbos, the missing sink means that this carbon is absorbed in the ecosystem, pumped underground. Now, where we know that the Fynbos plants don't have such extensive root systems, so this carbon is somehow stored either in the soil or released into potentially the groundwater and leads to a long-term storage. What also contributes to the consistent uptake of carbon is a seasonal handoff between two different growing types. So the reseeders, they dominate in spring, in winter. They have a high light use efficiency, so even if it's a bit darker, they will grow massively, but then they slow down and mostly stop growing in summer. But during summer drought is where the reseeders take over. They have slow growth, but they can deal with the drought. And as I've mentioned, this is the next question: where does the carbon go? Is it exuded from the roots and washed out into the rivers, into a long-term storage? We don't currently know for sure, but I'm hoping that some of the data that we still have might at least shed some light on it. And if not, that maybe someone else will be curious enough to continue this study. I hear that similar effects are the case also in other non-forest ecosystems like savannas. I have not studied those, but I know that SAEON has some capable people working on these effects, so I'm hoping to see some results on that soon. With that, thank you very much to EFTON, to SAEON, and you have my contact information, and I'm open to questions. Ryan, if you want to.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think your talk gives us another reason to conserve our fantastic Fynbos ecosystems, not just for the biodiversity, but also for the function it performs globally, as we're finding out from your research. Um, there are some questions and discussions in the chat. Let me start with that while people gather up the courage to ask you a question. We do have some time. So something from Connor. Connor says it's really interesting that the respiration declined after fire. One would think that the thermal exposure would increase post-fire and drive higher rate of decomposition. Thoughts on that?
Yes, so you have to remember that the measurements were restarted a few months after the fire because the whole measuring station burned down. So that is one thing to remember here. We did not actually measure the initial decomposition, and we obviously the measurements stopped during the fire because obviously the instruments burned. And Abri can tell you tales of that. But also, it is the fire itself that mostly returned all that carbon to the atmosphere. So there wasn't that much dead biomass left. What was left were the resprouters, and they restarted growing because they have their thick bark. They were not decomposing anymore. And the rest was already back in the atmosphere. So there wasn't much left to decompose. There was obviously some charcoal and some ash, and that would have contributed to the growth actually by being mixed into the ground with the first rains and giving a nutrient boost to the rapid regrowth, which we're also seeing.
Thanks,
I hope that
Jonathan.
answers.
Yeah, there's another one from Christian. So he's saying that the Onkosik area receives a high rainfall compared to other Fynbos sites. So how does rainfall help with potentially drive faster recovery in this area?
So drought and aridity are indices that are strongly related to the soil type. Meaning, yes, we have a higher rainfall in this area, but at the same time, the water drains so fast that for the plants, it's not that easy to actually take up. You might know from observations from hikes or something that if you go even shortly after a rain, you touch the ground, you'll see that it's dry. So yes, that increased amount of rain might help the plants recover more quickly, but at the same time, they are still exposed to a relatively high aridity simply because the water is not retained in this ecosystem. I do have to say it would be interesting to have measurements at a drier Fynbos site, but I'll leave that to EFTON to decide whether they want to move their measurement tower at some point or add another one.
Thanks, Jonathan. One from Kim Porteous. So are there any specific mycorrhizal associations in Fynbos that makes the sequestration of the hidden sink more effective and efficient?
Oh, I'll be honest, that is not at all my specialty. I don't know.
So there are some associations with proteas, I know, and has been some research from the Yonkers Valley, but I'm not sure how well it relates to the um, yeah
All
to
I
the
can say is that these plants are highly adapted to this climate, and they seem to be doing better than the plants in the Mediterranean basin that has a similar climate. In the Mediterranean basin, there are quite a few mycorrhizal associations, for example, with the local oaks and some of the pines. But seeing how quickly the fynbos recovers, that completely surprised me.
um, so there's one from Caitlin. Connor says he can't turn his mic on, unfortunately. And then yeah, another one from Connor. The Solindo de Blamini has done some great work in Cathedral Peak grasslands, showing downslope movement of probably soil organic carbon, potentially a parallel piece of work, which can be used to inform where the carbon is going. Question you are looking to work on. Yeah.
Yes, so what we have are a number of water samples from the catchment, both in the main river at Jonkershoek and some from the Swartboskloof right next to the measuring tower. We're hoping that we will see, so I'm busy analyzing that, but we're hoping that we will see some carbon transportation there. You know that those rivers are very brown if you've been there. And so there is a high carbon content there, whether that is actually exuded from the roots or whether that is just biomass like leaves, etc., dying that fall into the rivers, that I can't answer currently. I hope that I'll have an answer that says a bit more in maybe half a year or a year or so.
And there's a final comment from Kim. She says, really interesting work. And she works for the Grootbos Private Nature Reserve, and they have a registered carbon project that is generating carbon credits. And
Mhm.
majority is based on fire management. So, however, this is using a method applied in savanna ecosystems and based on control burns. I think she would be happy to reach out to you and the team to discuss probably how this research could inform their project over there. So,
My email
Kim,
address
yeah.
is there, so feel free to contact me. I'm happy to have a call and chat. That being said, like I mentioned, when you have trees, you basically store your carbon in the tree trunks. That is above ground. In an ecosystem that is so prone to fire, that just means that you're bound to return your carbon to the atmosphere in a very short amount of time. What fynbos, the natural fynbos without any pines, for example, does is that it somehow pumps this carbon out of the atmosphere into the ground where it is safe from fire. And that's why it is so important to protect these ecosystems, particularly when we're talking about carbon credit projects. Because with carbon credits, like I said, most of the assumptions that are made come from the global north, where, forests and trees are considered the main carbon sink. Here it seems like we have a carbon sink that does not depend on a lot of woody above ground biomass. And I've mentioned that this might be true in savannas as well. I would love to see that because we need to protect our African ecosystems and we need to show that they need to be protected and not replaced by forests like some studies claim. These ecosystems are valuable and an important contributor to the carbon dioxide removal by themselves.
Thanks, Jonathan. So here's a question from Warren. Do you already have some results from the organic carbon measurements, or is that still ongoing?
That's still ongoing. But Warren, I'll be in touch. As you know, we have been talking about this.
Yeah, tracking the work by sea. Sure. Thanks, Warren. As Caitlin mentioned, you're welcome to raise your hands to ask some questions directly if you have any. Um, I was interested to see that since you mentioned the 3 years before and 3 years after the fire,
Mhm.
the probably I wonder what the role of diversity would play in your measurements as well, because as you know, a mature fynbos canopy is potentially less diverse than a young fynbos canopy. And with the rapid growth rate of bulbs, sprouting vegetation, I'm
Mhm.
sure that has also played a role in the high carbon uptake. So that component should also have an important role to play
Yeah,
in
it
the
probably would.
story.
That is more a question to the botanist, which I'm not. But but you're right. There are plants that annuals, particularly, that benefit from the sudden amount of light that they get on the ground, and they can grow rapidly in that first season. So it is not just the resprouting and reseeding proteas. Those are just the main and dominant species. That's why we chose to analyze those. Otherwise, it would have been out of the scope of this kind of a project. But you're absolutely right that those annuals will play an important role. Now, of course, when we're looking at the fluxes of the ecosystem, then that's the whole ecosystem. And that will include all those annuals. So we can't differentiate species from a flux tower.
Yeah, but if you visited the tower now, you'll definitely see those dominant species as the majority of
Yes.
cover. So the story holds. Um, I see a question from Lindo himself. Um, would like to ask it directly. Let me just see here. He apologizes for joining late, but soil carbon work would be interesting,
Mhm.
and he's keen to see the results of this project. And yeah, well done. So just a comment. I think this
Well, you know,
definitely, yeah, sorry,
mhm.
this project forms part of the SAEON series of flux talks. We had one from the Kimberley talk, Kimberley station, now the Fynbos station. I'm not sure if Lindo did speak about his one in the grassland. So the national story is definitely emerging from this network, which is great.
So what I've presented currently will form two papers. One is in review, and the other one I'm waiting for the co-authors before submitting. Um, and then potentially a third one if we manage to find something interesting with those water samples, which I'm hoping will actually happen. So then we'll have a comprehensive story. And yeah, I mean, that's where you'll be able to access it. I will definitely let SAEON and EFTN know the moment it's published, but they will also know because they are co-authors on those studies. So
So, Kim, I'm gonna be maybe try unmuting and see if you can ask your question directly. I think you are very interested. Um, okay, that must be the channel settings. But one last question from Kim. Has there been work looking at whether soil carbon is released more in the areas that are infested with alien invasive vegetation during wildfire due to more intense fires?
um, I think there are some studies. I haven't looked into that in detail yet because that's more the emerging question from what I've shown. Essentially, when I started this project, I wanted to look at what happens with invasion, woody invasion, particularly pines. And I was always hoping that we would get flux measurements from a forestry site, essentially to compare. Now, for technical reasons, this never happened. And so I shifted to the pre and post fire topic. But I am fairly certain that there are other research groups that have looked at soil carbon particularly. I'm more interested in the general flux question simply because we need this information for the CDR, for, you know, carbon credits and similar things. Um, where the carbon goes exactly doesn't ultimately matter in detail as long as it's not immediately returned to the atmosphere. But I will be looking more actually at the water. And unfortunately, I don't have time to look at the soil, but that soil and water question is one that appeared only during the process of shifting gears into the wildfire topic. So I would be happy to see someone else take on this question further, particularly.
I think with any great research, you're bound to have more questions emerging from from your stats. So
Yes.
you've definitely um, generated a number, and there's some interested parties willing to take that forward. So thank you, Jonathan. I don't see any more questions coming through. Do you have any final comments before we say thank you and goodbye?
Maybe two. We really need to advance this research, and thank you for that to SAEON and EFTON. We need to advance it because we need to ensure that we protect the ecosystems that we have. So my 2 points is thank you to EFTON for this focus, and secondly, this really is important. Because if we suddenly replace all these ecosystems with trees, then we will lose the carbon sinks that we have, and those are crucial. Yeah.
Yes. We definitely don't want to be replacing them with what seems like a good answer when it was likely to burn, as you mentioned, especially with the threat of invasive species in our catchments. So thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for spending time in South Africa. Thank you for spending time working on this data, and for also giving valuable feedback to SAEON and everyone that has worked on the project. I'm sure and is waiting for the rest of the answer to be to be given as you complete the rest of your research. So before we close, I'd like to highlight the next talk that will happen on the 6th of August. And this is from the Somisana team, and they were talking about the ocean, the operational ocean models. And I hope you guys will all join us for that talk in a month's time. So thanks again, Jonathan, and we look forward to the publications.
Thank you.